In 1279, an empire stood at the absolute peak of its power. The Mongol Empire controlled nearly 25% of the Earth's land mass, from the Sea of Japan to the plains of Hungary, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the tropical coasts of the South China Sea, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Less than a century later, it had completely disintegrated. Pause for impact. Here's what makes this extraordinary. There was no decisive battle that marked the end. No Rome was burned to ashes. No Waterloo occurred. No invading army conquered the capital and declared victory. The Mongol Empire fell apart in a way that most history books just gloss over. They give it a paragraph, maybe two. The empire fragmented due to succession disputes and lost its unity. That's not an explanation. That's an evasion, direct address, establish credibility and respect. Gentlemen, I know who many of you are, veterans who served in complex military operations, engineers who designed systems that had to work flawlessly under pressure, managers who held organizations together through crises. You understand that when large, sophisticated systems fail, it's never because of one simple reason. Today, we're going to explore exactly what killed the Mongol Empire. And I'm going to treat you like the intelligent, experienced people you are. This isn't going to be simplified. This isn't going to be dumbed down. We're going to spend the next hour examining a cascade failure, a perfect storm of 7 interrelated factors that destroyed the most powerful empire the medieval world had ever seen. Establish engagement. But first, let me know, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious how far this reaches. And if you appreciate history told with depth and complexity, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because this is exactly the kind of content we create here. Transition to narrative. Now, let's turn back the clock to August 1227, 0300 to 1200. Context: the builder and his impossible legacy. Visual: vast Mongolian steppes. Sunrise: a funeral procession. August 1227. Genghis Khan died during a campaign against the Western Jia Kingdom in northwestern China. He was approximately 65 years old, ancient by the standards of his era. He had lived a life of constant warfare, unparalleled conquest, and the creation of something the world had never seen before. When he was born, around 1162, he was named Temujin, just another boy in a minor Mongol clan. His father was poisoned when Temujin was 9. His family was abandoned by their clan, left to starve on the steppes. By any reasonable standard, Temujin should have died in childhood. Anonymous. Forgotten. Instead, he became Genghis Khan, universal ruler, established scale. By the time of his death, he had conquered an empire spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Twice the size of the Roman Empire at its peak, twice the size of the Islamic Caliphate at its zenith. But Genghis Khan left behind something more dangerous than enemies. He left behind a problem that would ultimately destroy everything he built. The core paradox. Speak clearly to educated audience. How do you govern an empire that one extraordinary man could conquer on horseback, but that couldn't possibly be ruled from a saddle? The Mongols were nomads. Everything about their culture, their economy, their way of life was built on constant movement. Winters in the south where it was warmer, summers on the northern steppes where the grass was rich. A yurt, their portable dwelling, could be dismantled and loaded onto carts in under an hour. Entire communities could relocate in a day. This mobility was their strength. They weren't tied to cities that could be besieged. They didn't depend on fixed agricultural lands that could be destroyed. They could appear anywhere, strike anywhere, disappear anywhere. But now they ruled China. China, home to the world's most complex bureaucratic system. A civilization that had been recording its history for over 2,000 years. An economy based on rice cultivation, which required farmers to stay in one place, maintain irrigation systems, pay taxes to support urban centers. They ruled Persia, a land of ancient cities, sophisticated urban culture, libraries and universities that had existed for centuries. They ruled territories where people lived in stone houses, farmed fixed plots of land, and considered staying in one place a sign of civilization, not weakness. A technical explanation for engineers. From a systems perspective, this was an architectural mismatch. You had a nomadic administrative elite trying to govern sedentary agricultural societies. The two systems operated on fundamentally different principles: nomadic governance, personal loyalty, face-to-face relationships, decisions made in council, flexibility and adaptation, sedentary governance, written laws, bureaucratic hierarchies, tax collection systems, urban administration. Could you integrate them? Could you create some kind of hybrid system? That was the question Genghis Khan's heirs would have to answer. Transition to succession. But before they could even attempt to solve that problem, they had to decide who would rule. Mongol tradition stated that the empire was the collective property of the royal family, not the property of one man, not a monarchy that passed from father to eldest son. A collective inheritance that belonged to all the princes of the golden lineage. Genghis Khan had 4 sons by his principal wife, Borte, Jochi, the eldest, strong, capable. But there were persistent rumors about his paternity. Borte had been kidnapped early in Genghis Khan's rise to power and held captive for months. When she was rescued, she was pregnant. Was Jochi truly Genghis Khan's son? The doubt was never publicly acknowledged, but it was always there. Chagatai, the second son, a rigid traditionalist, a warrior who believed deeply in Mongol customs and viewed any adoption of settled civilization's ways as weakness and betrayal. Ogedei, the third son, diplomatic, a skilled administrator, less personally ambitious than his brothers. Genghis Khan chose him as the next great Khan specifically because he was someone the others might accept. Tolui, the youngest, arguably the most talented military commander of the 4, a brilliant tactician. But perhaps because he was youngest, he accepted his father's decision without open challenge. Genghis Khan divided the empire's territories among his sons. Jochi received the western territories, what would become the Golden Horde. Chagatai received Central Asia. The heartland Ogedei, as Great Khan, would rule the core Mongol territories. Tolui received the Mongol homeland as the youngest son's traditional inheritance. Establish the fragility. But here's the critical weakness built into this system. The empire was divided among the sons. But one son was supposed to be supreme, the Great Khan, whose authority everyone acknowledged. This worked fine when Genghis Khan was alive. His word was law. His authority was absolute. But what happened when he died? When the Great Khan's authority depended not on being Genghis Khan himself, but on being Genghis Khan's designated heir? What if the other princes decided they didn't accept that designation? Foreshadowing. Remember this structural weakness, because it's going to destroy the empire, not immediately, not obviously, but inexorably. 1200 to 2000. Setup, Ogedei's success, and the first cracks, visual Karakorum, the Mongol capital, wooden palaces, yurts alongside permanent buildings. 1229. After 2 years of political maneuvering, Ogedei was formally elected Great Khan by the Kurultai, the Great Council of Mongol princes and generals. He was an interesting choice, and if you've ever been in leadership positions, you'll recognize the type. Ogedei wasn't the most brilliant military commander. That was probably Tolui. He wasn't the most rigid disciplinarian. That was Chagatai. He wasn't the most charismatic. That had been Genghis Khan himself. What Ogedei had was the ability to get difficult, proud, talented people to work together. Leadership analysis. He was a consensus builder. He listened to advice. He was generous, sometimes too generous, his advisors complained. He loved wine and celebration, which made him popular, but occasionally impaired his judgment. But he was also shrewd. He understood power, and he understood that the empire needed to keep expanding because, and this is crucial, the Mongol economy was built on conquest. Tribute from defeated peoples, plunder from conquered cities, redirection of trade routes to flow through Mongol-controlled territories where Mongol officials could tax the merchants. When you're conquering, wealth flows in. When you stop conquering, you have to find other revenue sources, and the Mongols hadn't figured that out yet. Expansion narrative. 1229 to 1241. Ojeda continued the conquests. 1235. He ordered the invasion of Europe, a massive campaign involving multiple armies totaling over 150,000 men. 1237 to 1240. Mongol forces systematically destroyed the Russian principalities. Kiev, the greatest city in Russia, was razed. Contemporary chronicles describe streets piled with corpses, survivors so few that they couldn't bury the dead. 1241. The Mongols invaded Poland and Hungary simultaneously. April 9, 1241. Battle of Liegnitz in Poland. A combined force of Polish knights, German crusaders, and Templar warriors was annihilated. The Mongols reportedly collected 9 sacks of ears from the dead to count their victory. April 11, 1241. Just 2 days later, Battle of Mohi in Hungary. The Hungarian army, the largest force yet assembled against the Mongols in Europe, was destroyed. The Mongols used sophisticated tactics, feigned retreat, encirclement, panic-inducing psychological warfare. By summer 1241, Mongol scouting parties were within striking distance of Vienna, building tension. Europe was in panic. Refugees flooded westward with stories of an unstoppable enemy who showed no mercy, who couldn't be defeated in battle, who seemed to appear and disappear like demons. The Pope called for a crusade. Kings assembled their armies. Monks prayed for deliverance. And then, twist number 1, the death that saved Europe. December 11, 1241, Ogedei Khan died suddenly at his palace in Mongolia. He was approximately 52 years old. The official cause was attributed to excessive drinking. Ogedei's fondness for wine was well known. Some modern historians suspect he may have been poisoned, though we'll never know with certainty the immediate consequence. The news took weeks to reach the Mongol armies in Europe. When it did, every Mongol prince commanding forces immediately ceased operations and began the journey back toward Mongolia. Not because the war was lost, not because they'd been defeated, but because there was about to be a succession crisis, and any prince who wasn't present when the new Great Khan was elected would have no influence over the outcome. Europe was saved, not by brave knights or strong fortifications or miraculous divine intervention, but by the Mongol Empire's succession crisis. 2 years of chaos. For 2 years, 1242 to 1244, there was no Great Khan. The empire functioned, barely. Local administrators maintained order. Trade continued. But there was no central authority directing policy, ordering campaigns, settling disputes. Various princes positioned themselves for power. Guyuk, Ogedei's eldest son, was the obvious candidate, but Sorkoktani, Tolui's widow, was maneuvering for her own sons. Batu, Jochi's son, who commanded the Golden Horde, had enormous military power, but was geographically distant. Political intrigue, threats, alliances formed and broken. 1246, finally Guyuk was elected Great Khan. He was approximately 40 years old, competent, educated, but not exceptional. And here's where that structural weakness I mentioned earlier becomes visible. Guyuk ruled for exactly 2 years, 1248. He died during a journey to confront Batu over a power dispute, age approximately 42, cause of death, officially excessive drinking, possibly poisoned, possibly natural causes. He had health problems. We don't know. Pattern recognition. Speak to management experience. Gentlemen, If you've worked in organizations, you recognize this pattern. What happens when leadership transitions occur every 2 to 3 years? When each transition is contested, when institutional knowledge doesn't accumulate, the organization becomes unstable. People focus on internal politics rather than external objectives. Long-term planning becomes impossible. For 3 more years, 1248 to 1251, there was no Great Khan. 3 years of drift, and during this time, something else was happening. Something that seemed insignificant compared to the succession drama, plant foreshadowing, quiet, ominous. In the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia, the region where Mongol armies had campaigned during the early conquests, hunters were finding dead marmots, unusual numbers of them, animals with swollen necks dying in their burrows. Local people avoided those areas. Bad spirits, they said. They weren't entirely wrong. Transition to crisis. 1251. The Kurultai finally elected a new Great Khan, Mongol Khan, son of Tolui, grandson of Genghis Khan. This was significant. This was the first time power transferred from Ogedei's line to Tolui's line. Not all the princes were happy about this, but Mongol had something his recent predecessors lacked: overwhelming force and the will to use it. He was approximately 40 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Russia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. He understood military logistics, strategic planning, and ruthless political calculation. Final setup for Part 2. Mongol's first actions as Great Khan were telling. First, he purged potential rivals. Members of Ogedei's family who opposed him were executed or exiled. Second, he reorganized the empire's administration, conducting a comprehensive census and tax reform. Third, he divided military objectives between his 2 most capable brothers. To Kublai, complete the conquest of southern Song China. To Hulagu, march west, destroy the assassins, conquer Persia, take Baghdad. For 8 years, this system worked brilliantly. The empire reached its maximum extent, its peak of power and organization. But beneath the surface, all those structural contradictions, nomadic governance of sedentary peoples, succession uncertainty, economic dependence on conquest, they were all still there, still unresolved, still growing more acute. Ominous ending. And in 1259, when Mongke died suddenly during the campaign against the Song dynasty, those contradictions would explode into the open. The empire would fracture, and it would never be whole again. Transition promise. When we return, we'll see exactly how that fracture happened. We'll witness the civil war between brothers that split the Mongol world. We'll discover the hidden plague that was spreading along Mongol trade routes. And we'll watch as the empire that seemed invincible began its inexorable collapse. Mini CTA at 1800. If you're finding this analysis valuable, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm know that detailed, complex content has an audience. End Part 1, 4,100 words, 2000 to 2500. The Fragile System Exposed. Visual map showing Mongol Empire. 1248. Fade to black. Single candle in Mongol palace. By the winter of 1248, the Mongol Empire faced what military strategists would recognize as a catastrophic systems failure. But here's what makes this fascinating. And I want you engineers and managers watching this to pay close attention. The failure wasn't obvious at first glance. Guyuk Khan, Ogedei's son, sat on the throne. The empire still stretched from Korea to Hungary. Tribute still flowed in from conquered nations. On paper, everything looked functional, but Guyuk was dying. Twist number 2, the second succession crisis. In April 1248, Guyuk Khan died at approximately 42 years of age. He had ruled for exactly 2 years. The official cause? Excessive drinking. Modern historians suspect poisoning, though we'll never know with certainty. Direct address. Pattern interrupt at 2200. Now, let me ask you something. How many of you in your careers worked in organizations where everything depended on one or two key individuals, where, when those people retired or left, institutional knowledge just vanished? The Mongols had built a system with a fundamental design flaw. It only worked when exceptional leaders held power. Think about the succession so far. Genghis Khan, arguably the greatest military strategist of the medieval world, ruled 21 years. Ogedei, diplomatic genius, held fractious princes together, ruled 13 years. Guyuk, competent but unexceptional, ruled 2 years. The trend line was clear, and it was pointing downward. Technical detail section for engineers. Here's the engineering problem they faced. The Mongol Empire was fundamentally a decentralized federated system running on centralized authority. Each khanate, each major territorial division, operated with significant autonomy. They maintained their own armies, collected their own taxes, made their own local decisions. But, and this is critical, they all theoretically answered to one man, the Great Khan. This works brilliantly when the Great Khan has unquestionable legitimacy. It fails catastrophically when that legitimacy becomes disputed. For 3 years after Guyuk's death, there was no Great Khan. None. The empire drifted. Armies remained in garrison. Conquests halted. Trade routes continued functioning. The bureaucratic systems Genghis and Oshede had built were that good, but strategic direction vanished. The various princes and generals looked at each other across thousands of miles and asked the same question: who's in charge? Foreshadowing, plant for later payoff. During this interregnum, something else was happening. Something few chroniclers of the time noticed because it seemed insignificant compared to the succession drama. In the remote mountains of Central Asia, specifically in the Tian Shan Range, marmot populations were experiencing unusual die-offs. Hunters reported finding dead animals. Some developed strange swellings, died within days. Local shamans said the mountains were angry. They weren't entirely wrong, but we'll return to that shortly. 25 to 32. Monkey's Reign, the Last Great Khan. Visual Kurultai Assembly, 1251. In 1251, after 3 years of political maneuvering, threats, and what amounted to a soft coup, the Kurultai, the Great Council, elected Möngke Khan as the new Great Khan. Möngke was the son of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son. This marked a crucial transfer of power from the line of Ogedei to the line of Tolui. Military detail for veteran audience. If you served in the military, you understand the importance of chain of command and legitimacy. When you change that chain, you need overwhelming force or overwhelming consent, preferably both. Möngke had both. He was approximately 40 years old when he took power, a seasoned commander. He had fought in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in the Caucasus. He understood logistics, strategy, and, perhaps most importantly, he understood people. His first actions as Great Khan were telling. First, he purged potential rivals, thoroughly. Members of Ogedei's family who had opposed his selection were executed. Their supporters were exiled or reduced to insignificance. This sounds brutal, and it was. But from a systems perspective, it was rational. Möngke was eliminating failure points, making sure that when he gave an order, it would be obeyed without question. Second, he conducted a comprehensive census and taxation reform across the entire empire. Now this might sound boring, census and taxation. But think about what this actually meant. This was the 13th century. There were no computers, no telegraph, no telephone. Communications moved at the speed of a horse. And yet Möngke organized a simultaneous census across territories spanning from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. The logistical achievement alone was staggering. It demonstrated that Möngke's authority was real, immediate, and enforceable. Third, he reorganized the army and resumed the conquests. This last point is crucial. Remember what I said earlier, the Mongol economy was built on conquest, tribute, from conquered peoples, plunder, the redirection of trade routes to benefit Mongol-controlled cities. When conquest stopped, revenue streams weakened. Mongke understood this. The empire needed to expand to survive. Strategic planning section for management audience. Mongke made a decision that any corporate strategist would recognize. He divided his strategic objectives between his two most capable subordinates. To Kublai Khan, his younger brother, complete the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. To Hulagu Khan, another brother, march west, conquer everything from Persia to the Mediterranean. This was brilliant delegation. Mongke himself would remain at the capital, coordinating, managing the empire, while his brothers prosecuted separate campaigns thousands of miles apart. The brothers were capable. Kublai was a sophisticated thinker, interested in Chinese culture and administration. Hulagu was a ruthless military commander. For 8 years, from 1251 to 1259, this system worked beautifully. Shift to Hulagu's campaign, narrative tension building. 1253, Hulagu began his western campaign. His army was enormous, by some estimates 120,000 men, possibly more. Siege engineers, Chinese technicians who understood gunpowder, the finest cavalry in the world. His objective, destroy the assassins' fortresses in Persia, then conquer Baghdad. The assassins, you might know them as the Hashashins, were a militant Shia sect that had terrorized the Islamic world for over a century. They had perfected the art of political assassination. They held impregnable mountain fortresses. 1256, Hulagu systematically reduced these fortresses, one by one. The Mongols didn't waste time with prolonged sieges. They brought siege engines, catapults, specialists who could reduce stone walls to rubble. When a fortress fell, they killed everyone inside. By late 1256, the assassins were effectively destroyed as a political force. Building to major event. Increased tension. But the real prize lay ahead. Baghdad. For 500 years, Baghdad had been the jewel of the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, center of learning, culture, trade. The House of Wisdom, libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. In 1257, Hulagu sent an ultimatum to Caliph al-Mustasim: surrender, dismantle your fortifications, acknowledge Mongol supremacy. The Caliph refused. Technical military detail. The siege of Baghdad began in January 1258. Hulagu's engineers, and this is where you see the sophistication of Mongol military technology, diverted water from the Tigris River to flood the defensive trenches the Baghdadis had dug. The city walls, while impressive, weren't designed to withstand the type of siege engines the Mongols deployed. Chinese-designed trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Gunpowder weapons, primitive by later standards, but devastating for the time. The siege lasted 2 weeks. February 10, 1258. The Mongols breached the walls. What followed was one of the most devastating sacks in medieval history. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from destroyed manuscripts, then red with blood. The Caliph himself was executed. Hulagu, adhering to Mongol custom that royal blood should not be spilled on the ground, had him wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. Pause for gravity. 500 years of civilization, the center of the Islamic world. Gone in 2 weeks. 32 to 37. The secret beneath the conquest. Perspective shift. From medieval to modern, from war correspondent to scientist, major pattern interrupt. Twist number 3. The hidden plague origin. Now, I want you to think like scientists for a moment. Forget the drama of siege warfare. Think about epidemiology, disease vectors, ecological disruption, because while Hulagu's army was destroying Baghdad, they were doing something else, something they had no idea they were doing. They were spreading a plague. Modern genetic research explanation. In 2016, a team of geneticists published groundbreaking research in the journal Nature. They had sequenced the genome of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, from victims who died during the Black Death in the 14th century. What they discovered rewrote our understanding of the plague's origin. The bacterium didn't just suddenly appear in the 1340s, as traditional histories claimed. Its genetic lineage could be traced back much earlier, to Central Asia, specifically to the Tian Shan mountain range on the border between modern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and the genetic evidence suggested a Big Bang event, a sudden dispersal, sometime in the early to mid-13th century, right when the Mongols were conducting their conquests through exactly those regions. Technical epidemiology for educated audience. Yersinia pestis naturally exists in marmot populations in Central Asia. In stable ecosystems, it remains in what epidemiologists call an enzootic state, present, but not widely spreading. Marmots are burrowing rodents, relatives of groundhogs. They live in colonies. The bacterium can exist in their fleas, occasionally infecting individual animals, but usually not causing population-wide die-offs. The key word there is stable. Now, imagine what happens when you march an army of 120,000 men through these regions, along with hundreds of thousands of horses, camels, supply trains, camp followers. You're creating massive ecological disruption. You're disturbing burrows. You're bringing in new host species, horses, humans, rats that follow human encampments. You're providing new pathways for the bacterium to jump species. Connect to earlier foreshadowing. Remember those marmot die-offs I mentioned during the succession crisis after Guyuk's death? That was likely an early outbreak. But the major dispersal event, the Big Bang, probably occurred during the Mongol campaigns through Central Asia between 1218 and 1235 and 1218. Genghis Khan conquers the Karakitai Khanate right through the Tian Shan region, 1232 to 1233, the siege of Kaifeng in northern China. Contemporary records describe a horrific epidemic that killed over 1 million people in the city. Historians traditionally attributed this to famine, but the symptoms described, sudden onset, high fever, swellings in the groin and armpits, sound remarkably like bubonic plague. 1258, Hulagu's campaign to Baghdad. The army marched through Persia, through regions where the plague had, by this point, likely established new reservoir populations in local rodent species. The crucial insight: speak directly to audience. Here's what makes this particularly tragic from a historical perspective. The Mongols built the greatest transcontinental trade and transportation network the medieval world had ever seen, the famous Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing under the protection of a single imperial authority. Marco Polo's journey was only possible because of this system. But that same system, those trade routes, those supply lines, those garrison posts every few dozen miles, became a highway for the plague. The bacterium could now jump from Central Asia to China, from China to Persia, from Persia to the Black Sea, from the Black Sea to Europe. It didn't happen all at once. The plague spread slowly, establishing new populations of infected rodents in city after city, like a slow-motion biological invasion. For now, in the late 1250s, it remained largely invisible. Local outbreaks, nothing that seemed connected to a larger pattern, but it was there, spreading, growing. Return to historical narrative, smooth transition. Hulagu had no idea of any of this. In 1259, he was preparing to march further west, possibly to conquer Syria and Egypt, when he received devastating news. 37 to 43, the civil war for the empire's soul, tense, scene setting, emotional shift from analytical to dramatic. Twist number 4, the succession crisis that split the world. August 11, 1259, Mongol Khan died during a military campaign in southern China. He was approximately 48 years old. The exact cause of death remains disputed. Some sources say dysentery. Others say he died from wounds sustained during the siege of a Song dynasty fortress. Still others whisper assassination. What we know with certainty, the death was sudden and unexpected, and Mongol left no clear designated successor. Direct address, major pattern, interrupt at 39 minutes. Gentlemen, if you've served in command positions, if you've managed organizations, you know what happens when a leader dies unexpectedly without a clear succession plan. Chaos. When Kublai Khan received the news, he was in northern China. His campaign against the Song dynasty was going well. He had the momentum. His advisors told him, continue the campaign, finish the conquest, then secure your claim to the throne from a position of strength. Kublai made a different choice. He immediately suspended military operations and rushed back toward the Mongol heartland. Because he understood something crucial. The throne would go to whoever could reach the capital first and secure the support of enough princes to legitimize their claim. This wasn't about military strength alone. This was about politics, relationships, legitimacy. But Kublai had a problem. His younger brother, Arik Bokeh, was already in Karakoram, the traditional Mongol capital, and had the support of the most conservative Mongol princes. Character development. Make the conflict personal. This wasn't just a power struggle. These were brothers who had fought together, who had grown up in the same yurt, who had been given their commands by their older brother Mongol. But they represented fundamentally different visions of what the Mongol Empire should be. Kublai's vision, the empire must continue evolving, must adopt the sophisticated administrative systems of the civilizations it conquered, must learn from Chinese bureaucracy, Persian science, European trade practices, must become, in effect, a new kind of multicultural superstate. Arik Bokeh's vision, the empire must return to its roots, to the traditions of Genghis Khan, to the nomadic lifestyle, to Mongol purity. The moment you start adopting Chinese customs, Persian culture, you stop being Mongol. You become the conquered, not the conqueror. Military/strategic analysis. From a strategic standpoint, both positions had merit. Kublai's argument, we now rule sedentary civilizations with complex economies. You can't govern China from a saddle. You can't collect taxes from farmers if your capital is a mobile camp. We must adapt. Arik Bokeh's argument, our strength came from our mobility, our independence from cities and farms. The moment we tie ourselves to stone palaces and rice fields, we become vulnerable. We lose what made us unbeatable. This is what I meant earlier when I called this a conflict over the soul of the empire. 1260. Both brothers declared themselves Great Khan. Both held kurultes, assemblies of princes, that proclaimed their legitimacy. The empire, for the first time since Genghis Khan's death, was in open civil war. Detailed campaign analysis for military veterans. The civil war lasted 4 years. Let me give you some tactical details because this wasn't just political maneuvering. This was sophisticated military campaigning across enormous distances. Kublai's advantages. Control of northern China, the wealthiest, most productive region of the empire. Access to Chinese engineers, siege equipment, gunpowder weapons, larger population base for recruitment, better supply lines. Arik Bokeh's advantages. Control of the traditional heartland gave him legitimacy in the eyes of conservative Mongols. Support from the most traditionalist princes, shorter internal supply lines. Knowledge of the terrain at 1261, Arik Bokeh launched an offensive aimed at cutting Kublai's supply lines and forcing him to withdraw from Chinese territories. The strategy was sound. If Arik Bokeh could interdict the trade routes and grain shipments that Kublai depended on, he could starve Kublai's army without engaging in a direct battle. But Kublai had learned from Chinese strategic thinking. He didn't just rely on a single supply route, he had multiple redundant systems. granaries positioned throughout his territory, contracts with local Chinese merchants. 1262. The tide turned. Kublai's forces, better supplied and better equipped, began pushing Arik-Boke back toward the traditional heartland. 1264. Arik-Boke, facing desertion, dwindling supplies, and the defection of key allies, surrendered to Kublai. Kublai showed mercy. He didn't execute his brother. Arik-Boke lived the rest of his life in comfortable exile. He died in 1266, possibly from illness, possibly from poison. We'll never know. The cost of victory, somber tone. But the victory was Pyrrhic in the truest sense. The empire was shattered. Map visual showing empire splitting. Use multiple perspectives. Twist number 5, the four Khanate. While Kublai and Arik-Boke were fighting their civil war, something irreversible was happening across the rest of the empire. The other major Khanates were making a choice that would define the next century of Eurasian history. They chose independence. The Golden Horde, modern Russia and Eastern Europe. Berke Khan, grandson of Joki, had been watching the civil war with calculating eyes. In 1260, he made a decision that shocked the Mongol world. He converted to Islam. This wasn't just a personal religious choice, this was a political statement. We are no longer part of your Tengri-worshipping Mongol confederation. We are our own entity. 1262. Berke Khan went even further. He launched a war against Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia. Think about that. Mongols fighting Mongols, not in a succession dispute, but in a territorial war between two established Khanates. The unity of the empire was completely shattered. The Ilkhanate, Persia, and the Middle East. Hulagu had retreated from his westward campaign after hearing of Möngke's death. He remained nominally loyal to Kublai. They had fought together. They had a relationship. But nominal loyalty across thousands of miles of territory, with no practical way to coordinate, with potentially hostile Khanates in between? That's not unity. That's fiction. The Ilkhanate became, in practical terms, an independent Persian-Mongol state. The Chagatai Khanate, Central Asia, the descendants of Chagatai, Genghis Khan's second son, controlled the heartland of Central Asia. They maintained the fiction of being part of the greater empire, but they collected their own taxes, conducted their own diplomacy, fought their own wars. The UN, China, and Mongolia. Kublai controlled the wealthiest, most populous portion of the empire, but it was geographically isolated from the others, separated by mountains, deserts, potentially hostile Khanates. Systems analysis. Speak to engineers and managers. From an organizational perspective, what happened here is textbook decentralization failure. The Mongol Empire had always been somewhat federated, but there had always a great Khan whose authority was unquestioned, who could summon armies from any Khanate, who could order a prince to campaign in a distant region, and that prince would obey. By 1264, that central authority no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Kublai was the great Khan, on paper. But the Golden Horde didn't obey him. The Chagatai Khanate paid him lip service. Even the Ilkhanate, the most loyal, operated independently. The empire had become four separate empires that happened to share a common origin story. Foreshadowing the next section, and now each of these empires would face its own challenges, its own succession crises, its own internal contradictions. Because the core problems that had destroyed Mongol unity, problems of succession, of cultural identity, of economic sustainability, of minority rule over majority populations, those problems hadn't gone away. They had just been distributed across four separate entities instead of one. And there was one more problem, one that none of them knew about yet. That plague I mentioned, the one spreading slowly, silently, establishing new reservoir populations across the trade routes of Eurasia, it was still there, still spreading, and in less than a century it would explode. End Part 2 with dramatic tension and transition promise. When we return, we'll see how Kublai Khan attempted the impossible, ruling the largest sedentary empire in history while maintaining Mongol identity. We'll see his spectacular failures in Japan, twice that would drain the empire's wealth. We'll watch as each Khanate drifted further from its Mongol roots, adopting the religions and cultures of the people they conquered. And we'll see how, in 1346, at a small trading port on the Black Sea, all those hidden threads, the plague, the succession crisis, the economic fragility, the cultural assimilation, would finally come together in what historians would later call the Black Death. The fall of the Mongol Empire wasn't a single event. It was a cascade failure, a perfect storm. And the next phase of that storm was about to begin. Fade to transition. Visual. Throne room in Khanbaliq, Beijing, 1271. Kublai Khan sitting on a Chinese-style throne, wearing silk robes. Mongol generals in the back, looking uncomfortable. 1271 Punitamo. 7 years after defeating his brother Arik Bokeh, Kublai Khan made a decision that would scandalize traditional Mongols but was, from an administrative standpoint, inevitable. He declared the establishment of the Yuan dynasty, not a Khanate, not a Mongol ruling council, a Chinese dynasty, with himself as Emperor of China. Direct address. Speak to management experience. Now, if you've ever managed a merger between two companies with completely different cultures, you'll understand the challenge Kublai was facing. He needed to govern China, home to over 100 million people, the world's most sophisticated bureaucracy, an economy based on agriculture, trade, and manufacturing, an empire that had been functioning for over 2,000 years. But he couldn't afford to alienate the Mongol military elite. They were his power base, the warriors who had conquered this territory. They expected rewards, status, and most importantly, they expected him to remain Mongol. Kublai's solution was to try to be both things simultaneously. He moved the capital from Karakorum, the traditional Mongol capital on the steppes, to Khanbaliq, which we know today as Beijing. But he maintained a second capital, Chengdu. You might know it by its English name, Xanadu, the Summer Palace, located closer to the steppes, where Mongol princes could hunt, practice horseback archery, maintain their traditional lifestyle. He implemented a class system, first class Mongols, regardless of ability or contribution. Second class, Semu, various peoples, primarily Central Asians, Persians, Turks, the cosmopolitan elite. Third class, Hanren, Northern Chinese, conquered earlier, somewhat trusted. Fourth class, Nanren, Southern Chinese, recently conquered, least trusted. This wasn't unusual for conquest states. But here's the problem from a systems engineering perspective. Mongols comprised less than 2% of the Yuan Empire's population, maybe less than 1%. You're trying to run an empire of 100 million people with an administrative elite of maybe 1 million, most of whom don't speak the local languages, don't understand the local customs, and fundamentally distrust the people they're governing. That's not a sustainable architecture. Shift to narrative drama. Build tension. But Kublai was determined to make it work, and for the first decade, it seemed like he might succeed. 1271 to 1279, he completed the conquest of the Southern Song dynasty, the final holdout of Chinese resistance. It took 8 years of brutal campaigning, but by 1279, all of China was under Mongol control for the first time in history. The Yuan dynasty was now the largest sedentary empire the world had ever seen, and Kublai looked outward, at the unconquered territories, at the places where Mongol horses had never ridden. He looked at Japan. Military Analysis Section for Veteran Audience. Twist number 6. The Kamikaze Disasters. 1274, the first invasion. Kublai assembled a fleet. 900 ships, 40,000 troops, Mongols, Northern Chinese, Koreans who had been pressed into service. The plan was straightforward: cross the Tsushima Strait, land on Kyushu, the southern Japanese island, establish a beachhead, then systematically conquer the Japanese archipelago. Mongol military doctrine was well established by this point. Overwhelming force, sophisticated siege equipment, psychological warfare, terror when necessary. It had worked everywhere from Hungary to Burma, against every opponent they had faced. Japan would be different. Technical military detail. Here's the fundamental problem, and any naval veteran will recognize this immediately. The Mongols were cavalry warriors. Their entire military system was built around horses, mobility, the ability to cover vast distances, encirclement, the feigned retreat, drawing the enemy into pursuit, then turning and destroying them. None of that works on ships. The Mongol soldiers had been training for maybe a few months on how to fight from ships. The Korean sailors who were operating the vessels had been conscripted. They weren't professional naval warriors. And November in the Tsushima Strait is typhoon season, building dramatic tension. The fleet made it to Kyushu. Initial landings were successful. The Mongols actually defeated the samurai forces that opposed them on the beaches. The samurai, fighting in small individual units, weren't prepared for the Mongol mass formation tactics and use of gunpowder weapons. But they couldn't establish a secure beachhead. The Japanese regrouped, and that night, November 19, 1274, a massive storm hit. The Mongol fleet was anchored in open water. They hadn't secured a protected harbor. Ships collided. Cables snapped. Vessels were driven onto rocks. Contemporary Japanese sources called it kamikaze, divine wind. By morning, hundreds of ships were destroyed or damaged. Thousands of men had drowned. The surviving commanders made the decision to retreat. The invasion was a failure. Pause for reflection. Pattern interrupt at 48 minutes. Now, at this point, a rational cost-benefit analysis would say, Japan is an island nation. We're land-based warriors. The naval logistics are prohibitive. The return on investment isn't there. Let's focus on consolidating what we have. Kublai Khan did not make that choice. 1281, the second invasion. This time, Kublai was determined to succeed. He assembled an even larger force, 2 fleets, Eastern Fleet, 900 ships, 40,000 troops from Korea and northern China. Southern Fleet, 3,500 ships, 100,000 troops from southern China, total 4,400 ships, 140,000 men, the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. The cost of building and supplying this fleet was astronomical. Contemporary sources suggest it consumed the equivalent of several years of tax revenue from multiple provinces. Technical analysis for engineers. Let me give you some numbers to understand the logistics involved. Each ship needed construction materials, wood, rope, sails, tar. Sailors, trained, or at least minimally competent. Provisions for the troops, rice, dried meat, water. Weapons, arrows alone, hundreds of thousands of arrows. Siege equipment, horses for the cavalry units. Now multiply that by 4,400 ships. This was a project on the scale of the Apollo program. A significant fraction of the empire's total economic output directed toward a single military objective. June to August 1281, the fleets assembled. The Eastern Fleet arrived first in mid-June, landed on Tsushima Island and Iki Island. Again, initial battles favored the Mongols, but the Japanese had learned. They had built coastal fortifications. They had organized better coordination between samurai clans, and they employed a new tactic, small boats with boarding parties, attacking the Mongol ships at night. The invasion stalled. August 15th to 16th, 1281. Another typhoon, even larger than the 1274 storm. Marco Polo, who was in Kublai's court during this period, later recorded, "A north wind blew with such fury that the troops declared if they did not leave, all the ships would be wrecked. The wind was so strong and the ships so crowded together that many collided with each other and were smashed. Modern estimates suggest that between 60 to 90% of the fleet was destroyed. As many as 100,000 men died, drowned, killed in shipwrecks, or executed by the Japanese after washing ashore. It was one of the greatest military disasters in history. Emotional weight. Let it land. Think about that. 100,000 men gone in 2 days. And for what strategic gain? None. The pattern of failed expansion. Japan wasn't Kublai's only failed campaign. Burma, 3 campaigns between 1277 and 1287. Initial tactical victories, but impossible to hold territory. Difficult terrain, guerrilla resistance, tropical diseases. The Mongols eventually withdrew, having gained minimal lasting control. Java, 1,293 naval expedition. 20,000 troops sent to a distant island. The campaign became mired in local politics. The Mongol force withdrew after suffering heavy casualties and achieving nothing of strategic value. Each campaign consumed resources: silver, ships, men, administrative attention. And here's the crucial insight, the one that explains why the Yuan dynasty would eventually collapse. The Mongol Empire was built on a conquest economy, tribute from defeated enemies, plunder, redirection of trade routes, taxation of newly incorporated territories. When conquest succeeded, the empire gained wealth. When conquest failed, the empire just lost resources. And after 1281, there were no more successful conquests. None. The empire had reached its maximum extent. And an empire that can only maintain itself through expansion will collapse when expansion stops. But Kublai still tried. He still tried to make this impossible balancing act work, being Chinese emperor and Mongol Khan, maintaining traditional steppe culture while adopting Confucian administrative practices. For another 13 years, until his death in 1294, he held it together through force of personality. But force of personality isn't a system. It's not an institution. And when that personality dies, what's left? Twist number 7. The conquered conquer the conquerors. While Kublai was struggling to maintain Mongol identity in China, something fascinating was happening across the rest of what had been the Mongol Empire. The other Khanates were changing, fundamentally, culturally. The Ilkhanate, Persia. Remember Hulagu, the conqueror of Baghdad? He had destroyed the center of the Islamic world, executed the caliph. His army had killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims. His descendants became Muslims. 1295, Ghazan Khan, Hulagu's great-great-grandson, officially converted to Islam and declared it the state religion of the Ilkhanate. Think about what this means from a cultural perspective. The Mongols conquered Persia. But Persian culture, Islamic culture, conquered the Mongol elite. Within 3 generations, they were speaking Persian, building mosques, following Islamic law, patronizing Persian poets. They were Mongol in name only. The Golden Horde, Russia and Eastern Europe, Burqa Khan had converted to Islam back in 1260, but it went deeper than just the ruling family. By the early 14th century, the Golden Horde was thoroughly Islamicized. The Khans built mosques in Sarai, their capital on the Volga River. They married into Turkic Muslim families. They conducted diplomacy in Persian, not Mongolian. Russian chroniclers started referring to them as Tatars rather than Mongols. The Chagatai Khanate, Central Asia, the heartland, the region closest to the original Mongol steppes. Even here, Islam gradually took over. The process was slower, more contested. Some Khans remained Tengri-worshipping Mongols. Others converted. Civil wars were fought over religious identity. But by the mid-14th century, the Chagatai Khanate was predominantly Muslim. The Yuan dynasty, China, Kublai and his successors tried desperately to resist this cultural assimilation. They prohibited Mongols from marrying Chinese. They maintained separate legal codes for Mongols and Chinese. They required Mongol boys to learn the traditional skills, horseback riding, archery, even when they had grown up in Chinese cities and had never seen the steppes. But the reality was inexorable. Mongol administrators needed to speak Chinese to govern. They needed Chinese advisors who understood the tax system, the law codes, the administrative procedures. Their children were educated by Chinese tutors. They lived in Chinese palaces, ate Chinese food, watched Chinese opera. By 1300, third-generation Mongol aristocrats in China were more Chinese than Mongol. If you've worked in international business, especially in mergers and acquisitions, you've seen this pattern. The acquiring company thinks it's in control. It has the capital, the power, the leverage. But the target company has something more powerful: institutional knowledge, cultural depth, a functioning system. And gradually, inevitably, the acquiring company starts adopting the target's practices. Because those practices work. Because you can't operate in that market without understanding that culture. The Mongols could conquer Persia militarily, but to actually govern Persia, they needed to become, in significant ways, Persian. But here's what this meant for Mongol unity. By 1300, the four khanates no longer shared a common culture. The Ilkhanate was Persian Islamic. The Golden Horde was Turkic Islamic. The Chagatai Khanate was Central Asian Islamic. The Yuan dynasty was Chinese Buddhist Tengri. They didn't speak the same languages anymore. They didn't follow the same laws. They didn't worship the same gods. They weren't brothers. They were foreigners to each other. Remember Arik Boke, Kublai's brother? The one who said, "If we adopt Chinese customs, we stop being Mongol. We become the conquered." He was right. The irony is that Kublai won the civil war, but Arik Boke won the argument. And now in the 1330s and 1340s, as these separate khanates drifted further apart, as succession crises multiplied, as economic systems strained under the weight of supporting non-productive military aristocracies, the plague that had been spreading slowly, silently, for a century, finally reached critical mass. 1330s, reports begin appearing in Chinese chronicles of unusual mortality, entire villages dying. Symptoms: high fever, swellings in the groin and armpits, black spots on the skin. Remember that plague we discussed earlier, the one that had been spreading silently along Mongol trade routes since the 1200s? The Yersinia pestis bacterium that genetic research traced back to Central Asian marmot populations disrupted by Mongol armies? By the 1330s, it reached critical mass. We don't know the exact trigger. Possibly an earthquake in the Tian Shan region that disturbed rodent populations. Possibly climatic shifts that changed breeding patterns. But by the early 1340s, the plague was no longer moving slowly. It was exploding. 1346, Kaffa Kaffa, a trading port on the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea coast, controlled by Genoese merchants but located in Golden Horde territory. A cosmopolitan city. Italian traders, Mongol officials, Greek merchants, Armenian craftsmen, Jewish bankers. Ships coming and going from Constantinople, from Venice, from Alexandria. In 1346, Kaffa became the epicenter of apocalypse. There's a story, and I need to emphasize we're not certain this is accurate, but it's been reported by contemporary chroniclers that Mongol forces were besieging Kaffa when plague broke out in their camp. The Mongol commander, seeing his army dying, ordered his siege engineers to load the corpses of plague victims into catapults and hurl them over the city walls. Whether or not this actually happened, the symbolism is perfect. The Mongols, who had built this transcontinental empire, were now weaponizing the disease that empire had spread. What we know with certainty, by autumn 1346, plague was raging in Kaffa, and Genoese merchant ships fleeing the city carried it to Sicily. October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived in Messina, Sicily. When the sailors arrived, a contemporary chronicler wrote, they had the sickness clinging to their very bones. From Sicily, the plague spread to Italy, to France, to Spain, to England, to Scandinavia. Within 3 years, it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. But Europe was just one part of the catastrophe. Across Eurasia, 100 to 200 million dead. In China, 30 to 40% population loss. In the Middle East, 30 to 40% population loss. In Central Asia, even higher mortality rates. Cities were depopulated, trade collapsed. Entire regions saw agricultural production fall by half because there weren't enough surviving farmers to work the fields. For the Mongol Empire, the consequences were catastrophic. The Ilkhanate, already weakened by succession disputes, the plague killed multiple khans in succession. The administrative system collapsed. By 1335, even before the main European outbreak, the Ilkhanate had fragmented into multiple competing states. The Golden Horde, severely weakened. Population decline. Economic collapse. Loss of tribute from Russian territories as Russians used the chaos to assert independence. The Chagatai Khanate, fractured. Local strongmen seized power. The unified Khanate ceased to exist. The Yuan dynasty. Let me walk you through the final years. 1294. Kublai Khan died, age 79. He had ruled for 34 years. His death triggered exactly the kind of succession crisis you'd expect by now. 1294 to 1307. 3 emperors in 13 years, each one contested, each one weak. 1308 to 1333. 8 emperors in 25 years. 2 were assassinated. Most died young, in their 20s or 30s, possibly from disease, possibly from poison. We don't know. If you're keeping score at home, that's an average reign of about 3 years per emperor. Can you build institutions with that kind of instability? Can you implement long-term policies? Can you maintain military discipline? No, you can't. 1330s to 1340s. The plague arrived in China, combined with heavy taxation to pay for failed military campaigns, rampant corruption in the bureaucracy, natural disasters, Yellow River flooding, famine from poor agricultural policies. 1351, the Red Turbans Rebellion began, a movement combining Buddhist millenarian religion with anti-Mongol nationalism. The Mongols are foreign demons. Heaven has turned against them. Rise up. One of the Red Turban leaders was a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, born a poor peasant, orphaned by plague or famine, sources differ, became a Buddhist monk to avoid starvation, then joined the rebels, brilliant military tactician, charismatic leader, ruthless when necessary. 1368 September. Zhu Yuanzhang's army marched into Khanbalik, Beijing. The last Yuan emperor, Toghon Temur, fled north to the Mongol steppes. He didn't even have time to take the imperial treasury. The Yuan dynasty collapsed. Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty. The Mongols retreated to their homeland. They tried to maintain a northern Yuan government, claiming they were still the legitimate rulers of China. They never recaptured a single Chinese city. The largest contiguous land empire in human history was gone. Gentlemen, if you've stayed with me for this entire journey, you understand by now that history is never simple. The Mongol Empire didn't fall because of one reason. It didn't collapse because they lost a single battle or because one leader made one mistake. It collapsed because of a perfect storm. 7 intertwined factors, each reinforcing the others. Let me walk you through them, because these aren't just historical curiosities. These are lessons about how complex systems fail. Cause 1. Structural contradiction. A nomadic society built on mobility, on seasonal migration, on independence from cities, tried to rule sedentary civilizations with complex agricultural economies, bureaucratic systems, and urban centers. This was a paradox with no solution. To rule China effectively, you had to adopt Chinese administrative practices. But when you did that, you stopped being nomadic Mongol. You became something else. Kublai tried to have it both ways. Summer capital for hunting, winter capital for governing. It didn't work. Modern parallel. Organizations that try to maintain startup culture while operating as Fortune 500 corporations. At some point, you have to choose. Cause 2. Excessive size. The empire stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. In the 13th century, that meant messages took months to travel from one end to the other. The Great Khan couldn't respond to crises in real time. Local commanders had to make decisions without coordination. Unity required extraordinary logistics. When you divide an empire that large among multiple heirs, you create competing power centers. But you can't rule it effectively from a single center either. Modern parallel, global corporations with operations in dozens of countries. Without modern communication technology, coordination becomes impossible. Cause 3. Minority rules. Majority Mongols were less than 2% of the Yuan Empire's population. As long as they maintained overwhelming military superiority, this worked. But the moment that military edge weakened, through plague, through failed campaigns, through internal conflict, the system became unstable. You cannot permanently rule a population of 100 million with an elite of 1 million. Modern parallel. Any organization where decision-making power is concentrated in a tiny elite disconnected from the broader workforce. Cause 4. Economy dependent on conquest. The Mongol economy was built on plunder, tribute from defeated enemies, redirection of trade routes to Mongol-controlled cities. This works brilliantly when you're expanding. It's catastrophic when expansion stops. After 1281, after the Second Japanese disaster, there were no more successful conquests. Revenue streams dried up, but the military aristocracy still expected to be supported in style. The empire was burning through capital with no way to generate new wealth. Modern parallel. Companies that survive on acquisition and growth but have no sustainable core business model. Cause 5. Chronic succession crisis. Every generation, every single generation experienced a succession crisis. 1227, Genghis dies. 1241, Ogedei dies. 1248, Guyuk dies. 1259, Monkey dies. Each time, civil war, power vacuum, or prolonged uncertainty. The Mongols never solved this. They never established a clear, accepted system for determining who would rule next. Systems that depend on extraordinary individuals are fragile systems. When you have a Genghis, an Ogedei, a monk, a Kublai, exceptional leaders, the system works. When you have ordinary people in those positions, it collapses. Sustainable organizations need strong institutions, not just talented individuals. Modern parallel. Any organization where the founder's departure triggers chaos because everything depends on that one person. Cause 6. Reverse cultural assimilation. The Mongols conquered Persia, but Persian culture conquered the Mongol elite. The Mongols conquered Russia, but Russian and Turkic culture absorbed them. The Mongols conquered China, but Chinese culture gradually transformed them. This diversification had a benefit. It allowed each khanate to rule more effectively locally. Persian Mongols could govern Persians better than steppe nomads could, but it destroyed imperial unity. By 1300, the four khanates shared almost no common culture. They were separate civilizations that happened to have a common origin story. Modern parallel. When diversification goes so far that divisions of a company have completely different cultures, values, and practices, the organization effectively ceases to exist as a unified entity. Cause 7. The plague. This is the factor most histories overlook. The Mongols didn't just spread the plague accidentally, they created the conditions for it. Ecological disruption in Central Asia during early conquests, a transcontinental trade network that could carry disease, warfare that brought armies through infected regions, population movements that spread the bacterium to new areas. Then, when the plague exploded in the 1330s to 1340s, it killed millions, including Mongol leaders, administrators, soldiers. It disrupted trade, destroyed local economies, created chaos. The Ilkhanate collapsed in 1335, possibly because plague had killed multiple khans and decimated the administrative elite. The cruel irony, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that allowed unprecedented transcontinental trade and cultural exchange, was also the highway for the Black Death. Modern parallel, globalization, creates enormous benefits. But it also means that diseases, financial crises, and other shocks can spread globally in days or weeks. No single one of these factors killed the Mongol Empire. If it had just been succession crises, they might have survived. If it had just been cultural assimilation, they might have adapted. If it had just been economic problems, they might have reformed. But it was all seven, simultaneously, reinforcing each other. That's what a perfect storm looks like. Final montage, visual storytelling. 1162, Temujin born on the Mongolian steppes. 1206, Genghis Khan proclaimed. Mongol tribes unified. 1227, Genghis dies. Empire at 12 million square kilometers. 1279, Mongol Empire at its peak. 24 million square kilometers, 25% of Earth's land area. 1368, the last Yuan emperor flees Beijing. The empire is gone. 206 years from birth to death. 3 generations of extraordinary leaders, then collapse. What can we learn? Success doesn't guarantee survival. The Mongols were the greatest warriors of their age. But the skills that help you conquer aren't the skills that help you govern. Structural contradictions can't be solved by willpower alone. Kublai was brilliant, but he couldn't resolve the fundamental contradiction between nomadic and sedentary life. No empire lasts forever. Rome fell, the Mongols fell, the British Empire fell. All empires end. The question is when and how. Complexity matters. History isn't simple. The Mongol collapse wasn't because they got soft or lost their warrior spirit. Those are childish explanations. It was because of a complex web of structural problems, economic dependencies, succession failures, cultural transformations, and catastrophic disease. That's the truth most people don't want to hear, because it's complicated, because it doesn't fit into a simple narrative. But you gentlemen understand complexity. You've managed organizations. You've served in complex military operations. You've engineered systems. You know that system failures are never simple. They're always cascades. Multiple points of failure, contributing factors that interact in unexpected ways. That's what the Mongol Empire teaches us. And perhaps most importantly, humility before history. We look at their mistakes, their failures, and we think, we wouldn't make those errors. But they were making decisions with the information they had in their circumstances, facing their constraints, just as we are now. What unforeseen consequences are we creating with our decisions today? What systems are we building that seem robust but have hidden fragility? What empires, corporate, political, cultural, that seem permanent, will be gone in 100 years? These are questions worth contemplating. The Mongol Empire is gone, but their story remains. Not as a tale of heroes and villains, not as a simple morality play, but as a complex, fascinating, tragic example of how great powers rise and fall, how success contains the seeds of failure, how the choices we make ripple forward in ways we can never fully predict. That's history, and that's why it matters. If this video gave you a new perspective on the Mongol Empire, on how complex systems fail, on how history actually works, let me know in the comments. What other lessons do you see? And if you know someone else who appreciates history told with this kind of depth and complexity, a colleague, a friend, a fellow veteran, share this with them. Because this kind of content that respects your intelligence and doesn't oversimplify, deserves to spread. Thank you for your time. And thank you for your patience with a 60-minute deep dive into one of history's most fascinating collapses.